So now we go to the presentation by Matthew Page, who will talk about the pitfalls in the use of statistical methods in systematic reviews of therapeutic interventions.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Wait, sorry, this is a microphone, not this one. Okay, so just some conflicts of interest. Just want to declare I'm affiliated with Cochrane Australia, and I was fortunate enough to work with two luminaries in this area, David Moore and Doug Altman, who happened to be on the advisory board of this Congress, but they were not involved in the decision for this abstract. And so David's standing at the back at the moment, and he told me he was going to bring some eggs to throw at me in this, but now that I've seen the size of this room, I don't think he's going to be able to reach me, but I will warn everyone in the third or fourth row if I see them flying. Now, many studies have evaluated how systematic reviews are reported. So we have lots of studies evaluating the search methods of appraising studies, and how they're eventually presented in reviews, and how they adhere to guidelines such as PRISMA. But we have very few studies evaluating how authors use and interpret statistical practices in systematic reviews. And so my colleagues and I published a paper in PLOS Medicine last year called The Epidemiology and Reporting Characteristic of Systematic Reviews of Biomedical Research, where we evaluated a range of characteristics in a random sample of 300 reviews, but we didn't place too much attention on statistical practices. So we wanted to use this sample, or a subset of this sample, to see how statistics are used in systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So specifically what we looked at was 110 systematic reviews of therapeutic interventions that were indexed in Medline in February 2014, 32 of which are Cochrane reviews and 78 were non-Cochrane reviews. They had to include at least one meta-analysis, and there was no restriction by journal or clinical condition or specialty, so we had quite a broad sample of topics that we evaluated. And we evaluated statistical practices using a 61-item form that we generated based on guidance in the Cochrane Handbook, the ARC Methods Guide for Comparative Effectiveness Reviews, standards from the Institute of Medicine on how to conduct reviews. And then we had one author evaluate 80% of the reviews, and 20% were evaluated in duplicate. And if there are any items where there was a discrepancy between two authors, these were resolved via discussion, and we considered these items as problematic, and we went back to the reviews that were only evaluated once to verify the accuracy of the data for those items in those reviews. And so I'll just outline some of the problems we found, which we think could improve. So we found 62 reviews used the random effects meta-analysis model, but it was often quite unclear why authors had actually chosen that model. So the choice of model was rarely clinically justified in about 71% of the cases. So it wasn't clear if authors anticipated or actually detected any clinical variability across the studies, or whether they were just influenced by the statistical results they found. And as I was walking to Congress this morning, I remembered there's been about 3 occasions where I've taught systematic reviews at courses, and students have asked me, why is it that UK authors use the fixed effect model and US authors use the random effects model? And I've always been perplexed by that question. I've never really seen evidence of that, and I didn't look at that in there, but country should not be a reason for why you should choose a meta-analysis model. Now, we also found that in about 30% of cases, the choice of model was actually explicitly mentioned as being influenced by the I-squared heterogeneity statistic. And so despite being discouraged in all guidelines and handbooks for systematic reviews, we still see statements such as, we use the random effects model if I-squared was greater than 50%, or the fixed effect model if it was less than. Now, the pooled effect was rarely interpreted as or acknowledged as being the average effect across a distribution of studies in these meta-analyses. More often than not, people just evaluate the p-value of their meta-analysis result and don't really make a distinction about whether they're trying to estimate one true effect or the average across a distribution of effects. And a prediction interval extending beyond the limits of the confidence limits was never really reported in our meta-analyses, and there's been calls that these should be presented more often in reviews as they're able to tell tell readers what a future study, what the result of that could be. So we could see more of them in future meta-analyses. Now, 42 reviews performed subgroup analyses, but vast majority provided no rationale for why they chose particular covariates in these analyses. They may have just been splicing and dicing the studies opportunistically, but they never really gave a good clinical rationale for why it would make sense to investigate whether the effects differ based on certain characteristics. A statistical test for interaction was not considered in about 70% of cases when interpreting the results. And perhaps even worse, the statistical significance of each subgroup effect was compared in about a quarter of meta-analyses. So in this forest plot on the right here, you see that the subgroup effect for women is statistically significant, but for men it is not significant. And in about a quarter of cases, when you see a forest plot like this, authors claimed that this suggests that the effect differs by gender. But when you actually look at the pooled effects, they actually overlap their confidence intervals quite substantially. And any confounding due to other potential covariates was not considered in any of these analyses. Now, we found 45 reviews generated a funnel plot, but when interpreting any asymmetry in the funnel plot, we found that nearly all authors just equated this with reporting bias and never really acknowledged or considered that the asymmetry in a funnel plot could be due to other factors. So small studies may be giving large results because they all delivered a high intensity dose of the drug, or were at higher risk of bias because of lack of blinding. The funnel plot included fewer than 10 studies in about 70% of cases, and a statistical test for funnel plot asymmetry included fewer than 10 studies in about 3/4 of cases. And that 10 studies is generally seen as a rule of thumb to help interpret the results of these analyses. And then across all reviews, we found that 42% of reviews didn't actually consider any limitations of the systematic review methods or in the included studies when drawing conclusions from the meta-analysis. 10% claimed that a subgroup effect exists when there was actually no evidence of this, and about a quarter claimed that there is no risk of reporting bias based on very weak evidence. So a funnel plot with few studies. So going back to this funnel plot here, this does not provide evidence that there's no risk of reporting bias, particularly if you have not even tried to find unpublished data in, say, trial registries. So some strengths of our work: we looked at a broad cross-section of systematic reviews of therapeutic interventions and evaluated several practices. But we only looked at systematic reviews indexed in a single month, February 2014, but we're not really aware of any other guidance that's been published subsequent to then that would have increased or improved the practices in more recent reviews. All our reviews had to meet some minimum quality criteria by conforming to the definition of the Prisma P statement of definition of a systematic review and be in English, so they may not generalize to other types of reviews. And some of the items were only evaluated by one author in 80% of the reviews, so there could be some errors in some items. Now, why did we notice several poor practices with the use of systematic reviews? One reason, I think, is because many authors who do a systematic review have limited statistical expertise and no access to it. And there seems to be this emphasis that anyone can do a meta-analysis. Anyone should be able to run a search, collect all the data, do all the data analysis, and report all the results, and all the responsibility falls onto them. Not all journals have statistical editors with expertise in meta-analysis, and I think a consequence of having the proliferation of user-friendly software for meta-analysis is that it makes it easy for those with limited knowledge to use these methods. So in conclusion, we found several weaknesses in how statistical analyses are used and interpreted in systematic reviews. And so there's a couple of solutions that I think may be able to help us here. So one idea, I think generated by Kay Dickerson and her team at Johns Hopkins, is to actually establish formal partnerships between systematic review methodologists and statisticians and journal editors of specialty journals. So they're doing some great work working with ophthalmology journals in actually being on hand to actually provide advice and guidance on all the systematic reviews that get submitted to those journals. We could have funders ensure that the systematic review team has statistical expertise or access to it, Now, there's several reasons why David and myself think that an update of the PRISMA statement is needed and which we're planning to embark on. And I think that we would like to discuss possible inclusion of more specific statistical guidance in that ongoing update. And we also need to develop tools to potentially check for statistical errors in submitted manuscripts, or tools to help authors write reviews, such as online writing software to help them report their reviews correctly. And there's one other thing I haven't added on the slide, but I can't ignore it given that Hilda Bastian is sitting in the front row in a very vibrant yellow coloured shirt. So I really recommend everyone in the room and those who are watching this via social media to look at her blog post on 5 tips for understanding data in meta-analyses. That's a simple intervention that may help authors improve their statistical practices. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Questions? And while people are coming, I will have a question about a subgroup slide that you show.
Yeah.
So in a subgroup of Cochrane trials, did you look whether these subgroup analyses and confounding factors were anticipated and planned in the protocol, or were they added in the end? That would be an interesting thing to see, whether it was planned. Then that can be a rationale for it.
Yeah, so that's correct. We did not actually look at the protocols of these meta-analyses, mostly because there were no protocols available for the non-Cochrane reviews. For Cochrane reviews, yes, we could have looked at that to see if they had anticipated some of these analyses, but we didn't. But that's a good idea.
Yeah, thanks. There first in the back, then Lisa, and then...
Yeah, Mark Helfand from Portland, Oregon. Well, I think on the funnel plots, you probably really, you found a real effect, a real problem, that people overinterpret them. With the choice of model, I think it's more reporting issues. I mean, they pretty much add up to, and so they're, to me anyway, they're crying out for a qualitative component of the study to get deeper into the reasons why they have these reporting problems, on why they chose a model. And the set that you offered, they're plausible, but there's other factors. So journal editors may be the factor that says if you didn't use a random effects model, you're not going to get, that's what we expect you to do. Some journals have actually said that.
Wow.
So sometimes the rationale for choosing a model and its details is within the statistician's mind, and they may not be the best communicator of that, or the journals may say, we don't want a lot of detail about why you chose a random effects, that's what we expect you to do. So I think that there's a role here before going too far down the road on the choice of model to realize that, machines, the software will churn out a meta-analysis without, you put it in, it'll come out, people don't think about it. The better the statistician, the more they think about the data structure, the purpose, all of that. And if you find out, in other words, if you just offer people software that's going to say, explain this, explain that, it may not deal with that problem. I think you should talk to statisticians, the best ones, see how they think through it, and see how that affects your results.
Yep. I think that's great advice. And I think at the moment, we still see quite a lot of reviews just being conducted without any help of a statistician. And so I think you're right, we do just see a lot more just punching the numbers into the software and not giving much thought. But I'm glad you raised the issue of maybe journal editors actually recommending choice of model. That's not something I'd anticipated. So maybe we should do some work with actual review authors and some qualitative component and surveys to see their experiences with this.
Lisa?
Lisa Barrow. So you had a 61-item checklist, I think you said, and you were experts applying it. So I'm just wondering how long that took you per paper, and then also if there's anything you'd knock off that checklist in the future.
Okay, yeah, so when I say the 61-item checklist, it was broken down into some things like the number of included studies, the topic area. So not all of them were on statistical practices, and it's definitely not something I would recommend sending out for, well, I guess we could send it out for maybe journals to maybe look through when they're using. So, but in terms of how long it took to apply to evaluate them, Obviously, once you get into a habit of going through these things, you can speed up, but maybe anywhere between half an hour to 45 minutes per article. Just because, to be honest, in a lot of the cases, the information just wasn't there. And it was quite easy to see when you have a very tiny paragraph on statistical methods, you're just going to be able to go, no, 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 no.
Okay, thanks. Question here in front.
Les Citrom, International Journal of Clinical Practice. As the editor of this journal, I get inundated with meta-analyses from China. And I'm always worried that, I may be missing something that actually would be quite good. So I need to figure out, what to pass on for peer review and what to immediately reject. And what I do actually is look at the question being posed, if it has any resemblance to clinical reality, and then look at the discussion to see if that discussion is framed around a clinically relevant, discussion of the issues at hand. And if it isn't, then we'll send it back without peer review. But I don't really look at the methods. And I depend on the reviewers to kind of look at the methods. So I don't have, an hour for each paper that comes in to check it out. And it would be really nice to have some kind of tool that would make my job easier.
Yeah, definitely. We'll hopefully be working on something like that. But also, if some of these specialty journals can try and engage with the systematic review community and people like Cochrane and other organizations to help bring them on board to do the evaluation of the methods components. And so I know even with Systematic Reviews Journal, with Biomed Central Systematic Reviews Journal, of which I'm an associate editor of, we do sometimes ask for more targeted review on different components. And I know BMJ Open as well, they sometimes just contact me for statistical review rather than, and it could be on any topic. And I'm not responsible for looking at the clinical aspects. So trying to increase your team of people that you can contact may help.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from there. Who was first?
It's just a quick public service announcement. Sorry, really quick. I'm really sorry about the Wi-Fi. If you're all struggling, I'm Trish Groves from the BMJ. I'm the official tweeter for the conference. I'm having a lot of trouble. I think you probably are too. We're on the case. That was all. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, now Cochrane question there.
Trish, that was very important because I tried to send a few tweets out when you were speaking, Matt, and it failed. So thank you for that. Toby Lasserson, I'm senior editor with Cochrane. That should be an obvious conflict of interest as well, Matt, because quite a few of the reviews that you've been looking at were possibly seen by me or my team, so I'm a bit nervous about asking this, but there you go. I just wondered to what extent you think the issues that you're seeing relate to a lack of understanding of any guidance or sort of the way that the guidance is currently written. I'm thinking specifically about the Cochrane Handbook, because a lot of the things that I think I'm seeing on your presentation, I'm sure there's a chapter for that, I'm sure I've seen it on a page somewhere. Do you think they're not being taken up well?
I think that they are not being taken up well because I think, as you said, a lot of the information is spread across the whole Cochrane Handbook. I'm not a statistician myself. I've managed to get this expertise in these areas because when I was young, out of university and started working for Cochrane, I decided to read the handbook cover to cover over a week, and that's what got me excited about systematic reviews. I don't think that that's the norm, and I wouldn't necessarily encourage that. But
I don't know how to say this, Matt, but that was my experience as well.
But I think we do need to create, using this as a starting point, maybe developing more sort of a checklist or adding sort of more this specific guidance and more user-friendly tool to help people become aware of all these issues. And I think Cochrane's Messier standards go some way to doing that. But obviously there's lots of other things people need to report in their systematic reviews, so I'm only just focusing on the statistical practices, but I still think they are important and somewhat neglected in all previous evaluations of reporting quality. And even when you look at people who use, so many studies have used the AMSTAR tool to evaluate systematic reviews. I have no problem with the AMSTAR tool, but there is a single question in there: were the statistical methods appropriate?
Okay,
That's true.
yeah.
Just maybe one last point. It's just that I also think it's being applied at the wrong end of town. I think the time to apply a tool is probably when you're actually running through the analyses. One of the things that I want to try and get sort of more commonly taken up in Cochrane is to have a sort of a pause point between the analyses being completed and the rest of the review being written up. So you've got an opportunity to actually almost like literally peer review the data. And I think something like that last point with the possible solution, that's a real sweet spot in the process for something like that to come in and check errors.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, cool.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so we now go to the next presentation.